We had earlier networks and action sessions earlier this year on equity. That was the very first one we did. And then the second one 2 months ago was on neutrality and network management. And here today we are talking about accountability. The format that you see here is based on the liberating structures method of what, so what, now what. So we are working to define this topic that we were talking about. Again, today is accountability in networks, then to understand the implications for us in our networks, and then have some takeaways. Well, what does that mean for us going forward? So that's our plan here today. Again, networks in action on accountability in networks. If you scroll down further to slides 5 through 7, you will see a summary of what we heard back from the registrants, including yourselves, in the questions that you had to respond to when you registered for this session. And we asked these questions in each of those registrations in order to have a starting point for these conversations. So that's what you see in, again, these slides 5, 6, and 7. The responses, the summarized, somewhat synthesized responses to the questions we asked. So the first question that we asked, which you see in slide 5, is what does accountability mean within your network? And I have tried to synthesize or categorize the responses that we had. So these top line categories are my interpretations, my synthesis of what I felt were categories of the responses. And then the bullets underneath are directly taken from the responses. They are quoting the responses we heard. So what does accountability mean within your network? We heard a few things in terms of these categories. So the first one that I heard when I reviewed these was this idea of fulfilling the roles and commitments that we sign up for. So then you see with these bullet points, a few of the examples, taking responsibility, showing up, doing what we say we will, completing agreed upon tasks, etc. Participating as we anticipate we should and commit to doing. So that was this first one. The second one, and that's sort of more at an individual level, you could say. The second one was about ensuring that the network works towards its shared purpose. So these points were really, in my view, about how at a network level, we are working together to try to achieve that vision we have, achieve that shared purpose that we have set for ourselves as a network. So making sure that we're making progress, that we're moving things forward, that we're doing it in a way that keeps us aligned with that vision that we have. And particularly also looking at—
what are you doing here again?
Looking at where we need to be able to acknowledge that we're off track and course correct, perhaps, or make changes. So that was this second category of the responses we heard for accountability in our networks. And if you are just joining us, Anna, welcome. We are working from some shared slides, which we were having trouble changing the sharing option. So if you— oh, but I think maybe Seema has fixed it. My trusty colleague, Seema. So hopefully you can open those slides right there, Anna, and join us. We're looking at slides 5, 6, and 7, the summary points around the registration questions. So again, the final point here of what does accountability mean within your network based on the responses we heard was also about being inclusive and equitable. This was, again, my phrasing for this category. And the bullets here, the examples, were about consulting with others outside the network, for example, or giving voice, giving power, and also sharing responsibilities. So how are we doing our work in a collaborative, inclusive, and equitable fashion? So again, when we're looking at this first question of what does accountability mean within our network, we see a range of ways in which we can interpret that. When we move to slide 6, And welcome, Janet. And we are working in some shared slides here. And Seema, my colleague Seema, will share the link with you for you to access. When we move to slide 6, we see the summary of the responses to the second question that we asked in the registration. So this is, what are the different types of accountability within our networks? So a few categories of this. So there were responses that were about multiple lines of accountability. So how accountability flows between different constituent parts of our network, let's say. So to the membership, to others in the network, to the communities, the networks, to and from, for that matter, the communities the network engages with. So these, again, different potential lines between the constituent parts or the various stakeholders within the space of our network. We also heard responses about who is accountable. And then, of course, again, this is those constituent groups in many ways. So we saw responses about staff, about the board, if there's governing body, of course, about members, also some points around funders. And then also some points around, this was interesting to me, I hadn't thought about it, but working groups or project teams or other sort of subgroups within the network that by their nature of having committed to something at a higher level of participation and accountability, they are also accountable. And so we heard, again, these responses about who is accountable within a network. Then finally, we heard a couple of other things that I sort of bucketed into this other types of accountability category. And these were things around accountability to timelines. It was accountability that is multi-directional, two-way. I'm accountable to you, you're accountable to me within a network. And accountability in behaving in certain ways. So in some sense, that goes back to that previous slide, and that idea at the bottom of being inclusive and equitable and how we are engaging. So here were the sort of summary responses to this question in slide 6 of what are the different types of accountability within your network. And then finally, a bit of a summary of that last question that we asked in the registration. Slide 7, what challenges does your network have with accountability? And how would you like to improve accountability within your network? So a number of things here. We heard about having clear and shared understanding of accountability, who is accountable, for what and to whom. Other issues, sort of practical issues around follow-up, follow-through, really doing the work, being responsive, meeting deadlines, but also questions and challenges around decision-making and power dynamics, and really that shared accountability that allows us to create opportunities and mechanisms for feedback and being able to hold each other to account. So lots of ideas here as well in terms of the challenges and potential areas of improvement related to accountability within our networks. So again, this was just an overview on slides 5, 6, and 7 of the responses that you all had to those registration questions about accountability and what it means for your networks. And that's the basis for our discussion today. So as you would have seen on slide 4, we're going to work through breakouts to have a couple of short conversations, again, along the lines of this what, so what, now what methodology. So this first breakout is around that question of what. It is our definitions. It is how are we understanding accountability in our networks, for our networks. And you can, of course, feel free to draw upon what is included here in those slides 5, 6, and 7 in that conversation. So what we're going to do is just put you into groups, into pairs to be more specific, and have you have a little conversation about, again, this question. Sorry, I'm setting up the breakout groups. 1 second, we've got one more joining us, and let's get that person in here to set up these breakout groups with everybody. So again, we're going to go into pairs. We're going to have a discussion about this question of what do we mean by accountability? How do we define it? And again, feel free to draw on those points that were the summary of the registrants, including yourselves, in those shared slides. So I think I have everybody in partners in the breakout groups. So we're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes. Obviously, feel free to introduce yourselves. Please do introduce yourselves to your partner in this breakout group, breakout room, and then again have that conversation of the what. What is our definition of accountability? So we'll see you back here in 7 or 8 minutes. All right, welcome back. So let's take a minute. I would love to hear how it went and what ideas you might have come up with. And we're also, for that matter, going to capture any points in slide 9. So how did it go? What did you discuss? What came up for you?
Kirsten, I don't know where my partner went. I feel bad.
Oh, no.
So Katie, we
Yes,
were just
you're
in the
right.
room together, and then now she's not here. So I don't know what happened to her. She
Maybe
got
she hit the wrong
lost
button.
in the Zoom ether.
Well,
So
hope
anyway,
she comes
maybe-
back.
Yeah, she might try to rejoin, but I can sort of recap. We were like just getting into the heart of our conversation, and we're like, no, we have to go. But one thing that I thought was interesting that came up was around like leadership structures and how, you know, leadership structures can help facilitate some level of accountability. But then Katie brought up some really good questions around, well, then who's on the leadership structure and how do you even create some parity there in terms of who has those seats. But that was one thing that came up in the course of our conversation.
Interesting. Yeah. And she's back. She made it back to us. Welcome
Ooh,
back.
I was worried, Katie, you got lost in the Zoom
I was
world.
just in limbo for quite a while.
We're glad you're here. Maureen was just feeding back from your discussion, so free to add anything that came up for you.
I mean, the time went really quickly, but I think, yeah, I just kind of heard the tail end of our chat about leadership structures within the network, which I think is a really interesting piece. And then I guess something for me that is a kind of staple to come back to is just the kind of relationship building and trust building to make sure that you kind of do feel that sense of even personal accountability as well. You know, you have a responsibility as and you know, feeling that kind of sense of feeling a bit bad or something if you haven't come through with it, because you do have those established relationships where you're you know, committed in a sense to the network.
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate all of that. Other thoughts and reflections, other groups, anything anybody else wants to share, or any responses to that for that matter?
Time as usual is very short in these discussions.
Always.
So the one thing we talked also about accountability also in terms of engagement and different forms of engagement. And Shannon, you can add some more. And the other thing is like the spectrum of accountability. So just how huge the spectrum is from the very tiny micro interactions to being accountable to a higher purpose or vision.
This is Karen, and we had a wonderful discussion with Karen and Eros, introducing ourselves and talking about our work, and it was great, but we didn't really launch into the key question, but it was still very satisfying.
That's just fine. That's totally fine. Yeah, great, no problem. Any other thoughts right now on this? We're still at the question of what and how we're thinking about accountability, how we're defining it. Any other thoughts on that?
I guess I was just reflecting on the word compromiso in Spanish, which is like commitment to another person, both personal commitment to yourself and then the relationship with the other person. I love that word. And I feel like accountability has a lot to do with that. It's like what people have been saying so far. It's like how you show up personally, and then how you show up in the interaction and the dynamic, and then how that shows up to what you're trying to accomplish together in your work. So.
Yeah, I'm really, what's striking me is also what to some extent came out in the responses to the registration questions, but this, as you phrased it as well, Yannick, the sort of spectrum of accountability and the different kinds of accountability at these different levels, which I think, Janet, is related to what you were just saying. And I appreciate I think there's a lot of nuance and depth there that we could continue to explore, which I find very interesting. Any other thoughts right now?
It makes me think a lot about just clarity. Like it's a complex concept, right? And so if there's these layers of it, then being really clear about like who's accountable to what for what, like, and some of that evolves over time. But if as a network, we're not clear on that, then I think it can get really fuzzy and messy. And we've had that experience with some of the networks we run, but it is so complicated. So then how do you start to like parse out those different levels?
And I'm also still thinking about the compromiso, which I find interesting because there's compromise, right? I'm sure. I mean, I know that the German meaning, I guess the English one is very similar to the German, which is different from the Spanish. But somehow there is also this component of compromise in accountability.
That is really interesting because so in German there's a meaning of compromise. Yeah, I don't feel like that exists in the Spanish version. I feel like there's in the Spanish version, at least the way that I feel it, because I'm not a translator, but it's just, I speak Spanish because of my upbringing. I just feel like when I say compromiso in Spanish, I definitely am including like empathy towards myself and the other person. And also there's kind of like a seriousness and a sacredness, a secular sacredness, let's say, to having un compromiso with somebody. And there's also not so much of a time-bound nature to it, because I feel like, in our work and in things and interactions that we do with networks, sometimes you flow in and out, people move jobs or something happens, the funding goes away and something, the nature of the network changes. But when you have a compromiso with somebody, it goes beyond that particular time-bound relationship, because that person is in your life, you're in that person's life, regardless of what titles or responsibilities change. So yeah, it's interesting, like thinking about it in different ways that the words are translated.
I was just looking at your slide 4 here about being inclusive and equitable, and it means in consulting with others outside the network impacted by what you do. So I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far is how are you accountable to those in the network, but based on whatever the network's purpose is, we have to be most accountable to those outside who we're trying to help, affect, move, whatever. And what is their role? Where do they have voice in the whole process?
Absolutely. So with that, we are going to have another round and have a different conversation, both with a different partner. And on another question, the next question here. So we are moving into this question of, so what? So we've tried to define this topic. We haven't landed on the ultimate definition, of course, and we won't in this time, but the so what is about, okay, what are the implications? What does this mean for us? So how do we have to integrate these ideas, or should integrate these ideas into our work, into our approaches, etc. So the implications, the so what. So let's go into a new set of groups, take around the same amount of time. So up to you if you have a chat, just an informal chat with your partner, or actually talk about the question at hand. I really am not bothered either way, but we're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes and then we'll come back. So see you in a few minutes. Hello, welcome back. I'm guessing that was not enough time, as usual. I don't know when there ever is enough time, to be honest. But then we get tired and then that's enough time, maybe. Anyway, I'm rambling. Welcome back. Would love to hear how it went, what you talked about. I'll take some notes as well as I was in the last little sharing post breakouts into slide 10 this time. But yeah, how'd it go? What did you talk about? Tell me all your key nuggets of wisdom. No pressure. Don't everybody speak at once.
Well, maybe to start there, the one you talked about, which I find really interesting, is like the need for clarity, and in that sense, I guess also explicit accountability, and also implicit or a more embodied internal sense of accountability.
Mm.
I question how they interplay.
Mm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. This is Karen. I was in with Arrow from Greece, who works on migration issues. This actually, we didn't talk about this, but I was on a different webinar yesterday and we talked about MOUs with grantees. And often the power dynamic is, how is the grantee meeting the expectations of the grantor? But really, we should be flipping it. How is the grantor responsible to meeting the expectations of the grantee, the recipient organization? That's really where the power should lie with the group on the ground. So we did talk about that power issue a lot. Arrow mentioned that she had met someone from Oxfam who was studying and researching ethical funding models and talking about what kind of funding can be harmful in different settings. And just also gender issues. Arrow, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but we talked about, okay, what are the Arrow, do you want to go? You want to talk about that?
Hey everyone. Yeah. So hello everyone. What we also discussed is how important is to consider, and it was also a question for us, gender participation in accountability settings, and about male being accountable to women, and consider also the cultural challenges and barriers this might bring in different places of the world. So it would be interesting if there are more people having any feedback on this type of approach, considering gender and culture. Thank you.
It sounds to me, at least one of the things that I'm hearing here, is just all the layers, right? All the layers that go into accountability and how we are accountable to others. And what the sort of layers of issues of identity, issues of culture, issues of tradition, issues of history, issues. There's just so many layers to how all of this plays out. It's something that's coming up for me. Other thoughts, other things to share?
I was thinking about the power. It's not just about identity, but power, which I think Karen also talked about. And then her question about accountability to people, there was internal accountability, but then also external accountability. And I keep thinking about that because I know a lot of networks get into trouble in terms of how they're communicating out to people outside of their networks about what their outcomes are, how their impact, or just how they're doing their work. And it's really hard to talk about systems change to other folks who might be saying, well, why are you prioritizing that when this is an urgent issue? So just kept thinking back to that question and defining who's inside and who's outside the network and things like that. So
I feel like we could put together matrices with all these things, very complex matrices of all these intersecting points. So as we're thinking of this, and you're sharing back with me, thank you so much, your reflections on this. So what? I would ask also the final question of now what? So again, we could have this conversation. We're just skimming the surface, right? But what does it all mean? What do you take away? What happens now? Now what?
I'm definitely inspired by the conversation with Janik to talk about it with our networks at Population Change Institute, just like to remind people or ask people, what metrics are you using to measure your own accountability to yourself, to your network, to people outside your network, to the communities that you work in? What are your goals for those, for accountability in those areas? How ready are you to engage in these type of conversations and try to shift any imbalances around accountability that you're talking about? And then always, who's at the table to talk about accountability when you're having these discussions. So I'm super interested in seeing how those conversations play out within our networks.
I love that. Who's at the table to talk about who is accountable and how.
Other thoughts?
It makes me think about like wanting to have this conversation within the networks that I work with, just to kind of surface some of these questions and almost do some collective thinking within the network about this particular topic. And I think that's one way to like make it more explicit. Because it is so much of it, I think, is not, and it's complicated and it's relational and all of that. But I think even just naming it and talking about it could help me better understand how to continue to support the networks that I work with in this area.
I'm thinking about doing strategic planning, which I imagine most of us have done. And having that question in each of the pillars or goals of your plan. So to whom are we accountable to for meeting these objectives or these goals? Or who's going to hold us accountable? Whether we name it or not. and actually be explicit right in the plan about that. I'm going to take that with me.
I think for me, I'm now really interested in thinking about the kind of balance between this explicit accountability via some kind of, leadership structure, and the implicit accountability, which is more around relationship building and kind of trust building within the network, and trying to kind of figure out where the sweet spot is there. Yeah, that's a kind of interesting takeaway for me.
I think it goes in a similar line. I'm still pondering about the compromiso, the word, and the circular quality it has, or what you said, like the secular, sacred in a secular way, because so far some of the notion I had of accountability, it's very directional and linear, but I think that there's something else in that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, what's our accountability to things like our attitude or just the way we show up, for example.
Just to add in and say that I echo everyone. I'm here mostly with questions in my mind and not with a lot of knowledge from my end. But what I wanted also to share and to reflect on is how we also promote an accountable philosophy in our organizations, in our settings, and in our networks. How we also make people engage with accountability.
We had a short conversation on how accountability shows up in networks based on a lot of where there's a lot of volunteers involved, and volunteering to the network and accountability in terms of to the network and then to the organization that you represent, and finding that balance of how to be accountable to both. Not necessarily how the money flows all the time, but how you show up and participate fully. I don't know if that makes sense, but some organizations tend to get a lot more of the funding just because of the nature of their work, but are really still very relied upon by a broader network of support, etc. So kind of balancing that accountability, it's all important.
This is fascinating. We're coming up to the end of our time, and again, I know we're just skimming the surface of what could be much more and much longer for our points around not having enough time conversations. But I'm so grateful for all of this, for all of the thoughts that you have shared here today. And Eero, I think I think I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm also learning. I think hopefully we're all also learning. So you're in a safe and welcoming space here. And happy to have you. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much. We will share the recording. We'll share a summary blog of the points that you brought up coming in our newsletter in the next, probably not next week, but the 2 weeks after that. So watch out for that. And this series of Networks in Action happens every other month. We will take a pause in August. So we'll have one coming up in the fall, Northern Hemisphere time, and open also to any topics that come to mind that you would like to request. Always open to hearing that. So if you have any thoughts about topics that you would love to have discussed and unpacked, we are happy to host sessions on them. In the meantime, thank you all so very much for being here, for being present, for sharing, for reflecting, for listening. Very grateful to be in this space with you all today. So thank you so much, and hope to see you all again very soon in another space. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.